Hello, welcome back to History of Wine and the Vine. I'm Emily Kate. So last week we spoke a little bit about the science behind archaeology and what you do once you find an object in the ground and how you can identify it. But this week what I'd like to talk about are the actual artifacts that exist from antiquity and what they tell us about wine. So I've broken it up into different categories of grape growing, storing wine, because we've already spoken a lot about wine presses, so I thought that I would move forward. Storing wine, mixing wine, serving wine, and drinking wine. So let's start off with the grape growing artifact, and I have pictures for you today, so I'm just going to hold these up towards the screen so that you can see. This is a falx vinitoria, and it has a handle, a knife edge for cutting away from the body, a sharpened hook for cutting towards the body, a sharpened back as a hatchet for chopping, and a point for splitting or separating canes. So this was really kind of the beginning of, this was what people used to prune or trellis their vines. So this was kind of a vine upkeep Swiss Army knife of sorts, and allowed the grape grower to be able to kind of move easier throughout the vineyard and to take care of what he needed to take care of. So next we have storing wine. So we're kind of fast forwarding through wine presses because I really have covered them fairly extensively in some of my other videos, and they're not necessarily artifacts that you can hold in your hand, so that's what I wanted to keep this to. So now we have amphora, dolia, and the Canaanite jar. Now these are things that wine was stored in throughout history. So I will show you. This is a great image, I think, in terms of understanding the different types of jars that wine could be held in. So this was what wine was held in and transported in, and amphora are kind of smaller version of dolia. So dolia are these big jars, maybe 2,000 to 3,000 liters, and they held wine when wine went on cargo ships of the day. And there's a lot of great images online about excavations of these sunken ships. And if you follow me on Twitter, I have tweeted a few, so those are really fun to look at. And then we have the Canaanite jar. Now the Canaanite jar is actually very interesting, and over time it actually changed shape. So originally it was kind of a more flat bottom, but that put too much pressure where the sides met the bottom. So in the beginning of the Middle Bronze Age, we kind of saw a shift to making it this much more pointed bottom, and that was just to alleviate the pressure that was happening right at the corners, and to kind of lengthen those edges out, and to relieve the pressure so that they wouldn't break as much. And coincidentally, this actually happened at a similar time when wine was becoming more the drink of choice for most people as opposed to beer. So this is in Palestine in the in the beginning of the Middle Bronze Age. So that is I have one more image for you, which I find really interesting, and I think it tells us quite a bit. This is an image of a stopper from two different angles, a stopper in an amphora. And if you notice, there's actually a little hole going through it. And what I think is important about that is that it seems to indicate that there's a chance that fermentation actually happened within whatever this was stopping. So this was put on the lid of an amphora, which means that the fermentation was happening there. Because think about it, if you're just storing your wine or you're transporting it, you really don't want a hole in the top. They would actually sealed with pitch. So they would have a stopper, and then there would be pitch around the sides, which is heated resin, in order to create kind of a watertight barrier. Or sometimes they actually even put like plant material, and then went over it with some clay in order to stop it. So the fact that this has kind of an escape for air is when fermentation happens, there's kind of gas released, and you need something to kind of let out the pressure from the container that's being fermented, unless you're making a sparkling wine. And so that seems to indicate that that was what was happening there. Now, once the wine was made and stored and shipped, it wasn't just automatically served, it was mixed first. So wine in antiquity was almost always mixed with water. And it's really interesting to look at how different civilizations chose to mix their water. So I'm going to show you a Kylix, and this is a Kylix, and it was used for mixing wine. And actually in the Greek symposium, there was someone called a symposiarch, and he determined the exact water to wine ratio. And then someone called an oinopotai was kind of like a butler or a waiter, and he actually monitored to make sure that the whole night that was the ratio of wine to water, which I think is really funny that somebody actually had a job like that. And let's see, then we have the different types of Kraters. So that was a Kylix, and as you saw, it was pretty flat. And now we have this. This is called a volute Krater. And then if you'll watch the screen, I'll go through not just the volute Krater, but this is called a column Krater. So as you can see, what's changed here is the handles. So this has a column handle. And then this is a Kylix Krater. And if those handles were towards the top, right up towards the lip, it would actually be called a bell Krater. So the different types of Kraters are pretty interesting, and they were used, like I said, to mix the wine. Now, something I find interesting is that the wine was mixed all together based on what the symposiarch said. Now, this is ancient Greece. In ancient Rome, it was a little bit different. So you could either cool or heat your wine. It's kind of like today we have hot tea or cold tea. And there's actually a way that you could, like a wine cooler. So this right here is a Pyskter, and as you can see, it kind of has this this smaller bottom, and the smaller bottom was actually used because, so the wine would be placed in the top, and then that smaller bottom would be fitted in to a Krater that had kind of cool water in it. So that was how they actually cooled down the wine. And then furthermore, there's this, which is an authepsa. And this was a liquid holding container. And this liquid holding container had kind of a door on the side where you could put in charcoal and actually heat. You would generally heat water and then mix it with wine rather than heating the actual wine. But what's important about this is that whereas the symposiarch decided the water to wine ratio in Greece, in Rome, every person decided for themselves what the rate they wanted the ratio to be. So it wasn't that everybody would have the same amount. You would all have a cup of wine, and then you would kind of add water to taste. It's like in Britain when you have tea, and sometimes they'll give you like a pot of hot water just in case you wanted to make it more or less concentrated. So I think that that's a pretty interesting kind of difference between the two. And here we have a picture of somebody that is actually using a dipper. So this is an ancient depiction, and what he's holding there, that's a dipper. So that would actually be used. It's really a long, kind of a long stick, and it has a cup at the bottom, and the cup is attached so that you can kind of dip the cup in and take out your desired amount of wine. And what I think is kind of telling about all the different styles of serving wine is that there was clearly a ton of sediment. So nowadays when we have sediment, we filter our wines. So we filter our wines in a lot of different ways. We have racking, which is when we remove kind of the top levels after something settles and all the sediments at the bottom. We remove the top level of kind of the clear wine. We have filtration systems where you kind of push the wine through a bunch of different sieves mechanically. You can actually drop like an egg through the wine and everything will kind of collect on the egg. Isinglass, which is a fish protein, which is used to clarify wine. So we have so many different things nowadays so that when you get your bottle, you can use a decanter if something's unfiltered, but when you get your bottle, you generally don't have to deal with sediment, but back then you really had to deal with it. So here we see a bronze wine set. This is a bronze wine set from Jordan in 1200 BC. And as you can see, there's a jug there. So somebody would have placed the wine into the jug first, and that's a bit of a kind of ancient taste vin. And then there's a strainer. And I have a close-up of a strainer for you. And as you can see, it's very simple, actually kind of decorative, and was just used in order to separate the wine from the sediment and the mixture. Now they really actually got quite fancy with these things, and they originally, so they had jugs, so they were beautiful decorative jugs like this, but really when that didn't quite cut it with the sediment, they actually created, and these are rough pictures, but these are from a book, which I will link after I will explain. And these were kind of these side spouted strainer jugs. And these had built-in sieves, and they're from around 750 BC. And people really came up with a lot of different ways. And I think I have one more. Yeah, here, these are clearer diagrams. So what these allowed people to do was drain the wine off the top and to leave the sediment in the bottom so that they didn't have to drink the sediment. Now, another way that people did this was with a siphon. So you would kind of just put a tube on the top, and there are actually images from like the 3rd millennium BC in Egypt of people with these tubes that go into the wine, and they're just drinking it off of the top. And this is smart because the sediment does all catch at the bottom, and if you really don't have a great way to fully remove it, it's great to kind of just have the top level of wine. So now we're going to move on to cups and different types of cups. So first we have kind of, this is from Mycenae, and it is a stone chalice. So we have kind of this idea of, this is more of a ritual cup, so this might not have been a general drinking cup. And there was also kind of these cups where they didn't have handles and they didn't have stems, but kind of the general drinking cup would be kind of this shape, and then it would have like a bulbous intrusion is the word that they use in the middle of the cup so that you could hold on to it. So if you can imagine, it would go like this, and then it would be at the top. You could put the wine in and you would just kind of hold the cup with your hand. And there's actually a really funny ancient cup story that I'd like to tell you, and it's in the book Tyranny by Kraters. And what tyranny is based on is if women ruled the world, and how they would treat men. And it's written, of course, by a man. And what he says is that if women ruled the world, that they would make themselves these huge drinking cups, big like ships and really deep, and they held a lot of wine, and they would give the men flat drinking cups. And then when the men would say, "You've had a lot to drink," the women would be able to respond with, "No, I've only had 1 cup." So clearly cups were something that people were thinking about, and the size and the shape of them was pretty important to people. So I have one more slide of a ritual drinking cup, and then I'm going to tell you kind of about a special cup called the Cup of Nestor. So this is another slide of the ritual drinking cup, and then up last there's this cup right here, this one, oops, and we're back to the beginning. There's this cup right here. And this cup is the Cup of Nestor. And it's really interesting because it's like a hybrid cup. So it's from Mycenae, and it has a chalice stem cantharos handles, and it's actually a hybrid vafeo cup. So there's a lot of different kind of cultures at play here. And these are interesting ways to figure out who was interacting with who, what it meant to them, and it's very interesting that you can kind of take away the elements of this cup and say, this is from one place, this is from another, and that's kind of what you do when you find artifacts and you're kind of looking to analyze them. So I hope that this was a really cool whirlwind trip through the artifacts of ancient wine. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I will see you next week. Cheers!